Quilt bindings are a necessary part to a quilt, and often they are a final thought, but they don't have to be boring. Today I'm going to show you how to add some lace to your quilt bindings to add a little bit more fun and pizzazz. I'm going to start with showing you this quilt here, and I'm going to walk you through adding the lace and binding on step by step, but I do have a few more fun quilts here to show you at the end. When I am adding lace along with my binding, I find that the easiest way to do that is to just baste it in place along the edge of the quilt. So I'll either just hold the lace in place along the edge of my quilt and baste it in place, or I will clip it, make sure I have enough lace, and then sew it on. So I'll just do the lace from edge to edge on the quilt and trim it off. It keeps it really simple. Now, a few things to think about when you are doing this is how wide your lace is. So if you have only a 1/4 inch, for example, wide lace, it may not work here very well because when you fold your binding over, if you're sewing it to the back and folding it to the front, it might hide all of the lace. Or if you're sewing it to the front of your quilt and hand stitching it to the back like I'm going to do, however wide you're sewing the binding on may cover up the lace as well. So I got a fairly wide lace here, and I measured to make sure I would still be able to see the hearts if I'm using my 1/4 inch foot to sew the binding onto the front. So just something to keep in mind. Now, something you can think about if you do have a thin piece of lace and perhaps it is really close to being a 1/4 inch thick, you could baste it in place evenly a little width away from the edge of your quilt, just to make sure you can still use it as a thinner accent with your binding. So it is possible to use thinner lace. You'll just want to think about it a little more and think about your placement when you're sewing it onto the edge of your quilt. All right, so I'm lining up the edge of my lace with the edge of my quilt, and I'm just going to baste it in place. It's really simple with this step, and then from there you can just move on with doing your binding like you normally would. All right, so I sewed to the edge, and I'm just going to cut off the lace right at the edge of the quilt. So easy, really, really simple to add the lace on as an accent with your binding. So here is the fabric that I'm going to use for my binding. All right, so I have my fabric pressed and ready to go. I like to go ahead and trim off the selvage on my fabric just so that when I cut my strips, I'm ready to go with bringing them together. I'm going to cut my strips at 2.5 inches wide. So I have my fabric folded in half, and the fold is down by me, lined up on a line, and I have my fabric doubled over so that I'll cut 2 strips at a time. I'm just going to square up one edge of my fabric, so I'm just doing that by lining up my slide lock on one of the lines on my mat, and then I'll press my slide lock down so that I can grip the fabric, and I won't have to travel my hand up and worry about my ruler moving to the side. All right, so now I'm just going to cut my fabric at 2.5 inches, and I'll line up my ruler with my freshly cut line. So I have my 2.5 inch line lined up with the edge of fabric. And I can also look and see if my lines are lined up with the fold as well, just to make sure I'm cutting correctly. And then I'm just going to go ahead and cut 8 strips from here. I think I got them all cut now. What we're going to do is sew these together end to end. When I do the binding strips, I lay them right side together, sew my 1/4 inch seam, and then I'll take the top binding strip here, and I'll lay it right side up, and then I'll take the next strip, lay it right side down, and go ahead and sew the next one on. And I'll just keep doing that until I get them all sewn together. All right, so now we're just gonna cut these strips apart. All right, so we're just gonna press the seam open. All the seams throughout here, I'm gonna find them and press them open. It just makes the next step where I fold the binding over that much easier. All right, and so this handy tool is my not so secret weapon to get my binding folded without making me cry or hate doing binding and just leaving all of my finished quilts unfinished without a binding on it. It is so handy. I absolutely love it. I will link to it in the description of this video. It is amazing. Just take note that these clips come in different sizes. So this is 2.5 inch. So if you're using 2.5 inch binding, this is the one you use. It comes in different sizes depending on what size binding you like to do. All right, so all you have to do to get started is insert your binding into the binding tool. So right through the area here. And then once you see it coming through, grab a needle and just help pull it through. And there's an opening on both sides to help you pull it through. All right, and then you'll take this and you'll clamp it onto the edge of your pressing area. You can see you can move it up and down depending on how wide your pressing table is. So you just kind of pretend this is the edge of a table. I'm just going to attach it on the side of the mat, and then I'm going to just hang it off the edge of the table just to make it easier here. So I'm just going to pull a little through and I'll start pressing it. So I just lay my iron on it, then pull the binding through and start going. I just lift the iron up just a little bit. The heat's still touching the fabric, and then I'll put it down, press it a little heavier, lift it up a little, pull it through. I'm just lifting it up just a tad so that I'm not warping the binding fabric. I don't want to bend it in any way and misshape it. So I just lift and press, and I just don't even have to think about it with this. It's just so much easier. I don't have to worry about burning my hand trying to fold it over as I press. It's such a breeze now. So much easier with this tool. It is well worth its money. Telling you, I love a wool mat too because I don't even have to press any areas for long because it really radiates heat through and it presses this binding nice and flat without using anything extra like spray starch or anything like that. I love the wool pressing mat. I'll link the wool mat that I use as well in the description of this video too. So I'm getting toward the end of the binding here. And if you ever wondered how well cordless irons hold their heat, this Panasonic cordless iron holds the heat really well. I haven't had to put it back on the charger once, and it was able to press all of this binding. So I think the mat probably helps some, but pretty impressive. I can still feel the heat there. So yeah. All right, so my binding is all prepped and ready to go. So I'm going to start sewing it to the front of the quilt. I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail so that I can join the binding ends once I get all the way around the quilt. I'm just going to pick a random place on the quilt to start sewing it in place. So I'm just lining up the raw edges of the binding with the edge of the quilt, and I'll start sewing it in place. I like to back stitch when I start sewing the binding on, just a little bit, just so when I bring the binding ends together, if I'm pulling or tugging a little bit, the stitches don't come undone. You know what I forgot? I usually like to use one of my quilting gloves when I'm sewing on binding, just because I feel like I have better control over the quilt that way. All right, since it's a little hard to show when the edge of the quilt gets up under the machine, I'm going to show you here. So here is the edge of my quilt. So right here, I'm going to mark it with a pin. Now I just eyeball the next part. When I get about 1/4 of an inch away from that edge of the quilt, I'm going to stop sewing and I'm going to pivot the quilt and sew 45 degrees toward the corner of the quilt. So hopefully you can see my stitches here. I just come off the edge right there. So now I'm going to turn the quilt and I'm going to fold my binding straight up, and I like to kind of press down that fold that I made, and then I'm going to fold it straight down so the fold is kind of lined up with that top edge of the quilt, and then I'm going to put this back under the machine and start sewing down the edge. I always back stitch there. I don't think it's necessary, but it's kind of just become habit. Feel like you may want a little peek at how it's turning out. I know I do. All right, so once I get this all done, we're just going to be folding this back behind here and I'm going to hand stitch it down. But this is how the binding on the front is going to look with the lace hearts peeking out. I am so excited to see how this turns out. So I'm going to get the binding on all the way around, and then I'll show you how I join binding ends together all stress-free. And then of course I'll show you all the other lace quilt binding ideas that I have. All right, so I sewed all the way around the quilt, and now it's just time to attach the binding ends to each other. So I just use the ruler on my sewing machine and I'll trim my binding in a place near the middle, and then I'll overlap my binding and trim, leaving a 1/2 inch overhang. That's all I do. I keep it really simple. All right, and then I'm just gonna sew my binding ends together with that straight seam I like to use because it's super easy and stress-free. All right, so I'm just gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. All right, I'm just gonna finger press it, and then I'll just sew the binding in place. All right, and so now all I'll need to do is sew the binding in place on the back. I'm going to hand stitch it on, and I'll show some video here of it all finished up so you can see it without me just holding the binding back to give you an idea of how it looks. So I'm really excited about how this turned out. But of course, I do want to show you some of the other ideas that I had for adding binding and lace together. All right, so here is the first quilt that I want to show you with a lace accent along with the binding. Now, it is very similar to The quilt that I just showed you the full tutorial on, I did a 2.5 inch wide binding again, but with this one I sewed the binding to the back of the quilt first and then flipped it to the front, and I just laid the lace out along the edge while I sewed the binding down by machine to the top. So you can definitely add the lace on without having to hand stitch your binding to the back if that's not your thing. Something that's really nice about doing it this way too is that you have a lot more control over how the lace lays along with the binding. So what I mean by that is when you have that thinner lace, as you lay it out, you can see exactly where you stitch it down, and you can move it around to make sure it lays just how you want it to. Now, if you're not into having a whole lot of lace going around the whole binding of your quilt, this next one is for you because we just have lace accents at the corner of this cute table runner. So you can see here that the lace is just in the corner, and all I did was trim the lace up so it fit the corner just like I liked it. And then I basted it down just along the corner. And then if you want to, you could stitch around the edge of the lace so that it doesn't move up and down, especially if it's a bigger piece that fills up more of an area like mine does. This was really, really easy to do. All I did was stitch the binding to the back of the quilt, flipped it to the front, and stitched it down, making sure to cover up the raw areas of the lace. I am so obsessed with how this quilt turned out with the lace on the binding. I had this idea to do the lace along with flange. I wasn't sure if it would work out, and it honestly was a little bit tough at first, but I did get it to work out. So for this flange binding, I cut the flange, which was the green stripes, at 1.5 inch wide strips, and then I cut the white fabric at 1.25 inches. Now I have this long piece of lace here that I just sandwiched between the two binding strips, and I sewed right out along the edge to sew it in place. I very carefully pressed the flange binding along with the lace, and then I moved on to sewing the binding to the back of the quilt. And when I got around to the ends, I realized that I needed to use my seam ripper to unstitch some of the stitches because I couldn't sew the ends together with the lace there. So that was the trickiest part with this lace that is longer than the binding. So keep that in mind because I'll show you another flange binding with lace later that was a little bit easier to do. But once I got that lace out of the way, I was able to sew the ends together of my flange, and I just left the lace ends hanging there for now. Now, when I flipped the binding to the front of the quilt, that is when I stitched the lace down. Now, I figured you could stitch the lace down to the laying on the front, but then you would lose that pretty flange that we had going on there. So I really wanted it to lay out to the sides. Now the corners were a little bit tough when I got there, and you see they do curve up there at the end, but I'm okay with the look. I really love the look of the lace sticking out and my beautiful little faux flange around the edge. I think it really gives a fun look to this quilt. Now, I am going to undo these stitches here, but I wanted you to be able to see them for now. I'm going to do them with a cream stitch and do them by hand, but I just stitched the lace ends together here. Just with my machine, and I think if I did it in cream it would actually be fine. You see I didn't even trim it off because I'm going to carefully pull those out and redo it, but that's all I did with the ends, and I think it's going to hold just fine because you'll have a bit of overlap there since it's not sewn in with the seam allowance. All right, so the last one here is I have this cute pillowcase that I made. And here I did a flange binding as well, but I did it with a much shorter piece of lace here. and it just tucks out at the end. Now I figured if you did just slightly wider lace, you could fold it up and stitch it down so you could still see the flange end here, but I went ahead and just let it hang as it was. But the really fun part here with this flange binding in the shorter lace is that it's not as tricky to bring the ends together. So when you sewed the binding to the back and flipped it to the front, when you brought those ends together, all you needed to do was to make sure the lace was laying in the direction that you wanted it to lay when you top stitch the binding down. So I had mine laying towards the white fabric, my little flange end here. And so that's how my lace ended up laying. Now, if you wanted it to lay the other way, you would have it laying toward the gray fabric when you stitch the ends together. So hopefully that made sense. I had so much fun sewing lace on with my binding with all these quilts. I really think all of these laces and different ideas really enhanced the binding on these quilts and just really jazzed it up just a little bit more. Now, let me know what you think. Are you going to be adding lace to some of your quilts in the near future? I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.